I love that song. One of the reasons I love it is because no matter what we bring to worship, whether we're walking on a mountain today or whether we find ourselves in the valley, that song just kind of speaks to wherever we are, doesn't it? Tomorrow's Memorial Day. And Memorial Day is one of those special holidays in our calendar in that it's kind of a time where we're coming out of winter and it's the first time people really get outside to enjoy time together on a holiday. And we tend to just take that for granted. I just really want to call us back to at least remember at some point tomorrow the significance of that day. It began back during the Civil War, or actually right at the end of the Civil War. And it still blows my mind to think, do you realize there were 600,000 young men who lost their lives in the Civil War? And that was when this nation had, I meant to check this, but at least a fifth, 20% of the population we have today. Well, at the end of the war, and I saw this yesterday on Facebook and I verified to make sure it's true, and I had it right here and now I don't have it. Oh, here it is. I found this interesting. Memorial Day was started by former slaves on May 1st, 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina, to honor 257 dead Union soldiers who had been buried in a mass grave in a Confederate prison camp. They dug up the bodies and worked for 2 weeks to give them a proper burial as gratitude for fighting for their freedom. Then they held a parade of 10,000 people, led by 2,800 black children, where they marched, sang, and celebrated. And that's the roots out of which Memorial Day comes. It's a day to honor those who have given their lives for the freedoms that you and I enjoy. And so I want to encourage you to take a moment tomorrow and do just that. What's your reaction when someone commands you to do something? There's basically two responses depending upon our personalities. And if you're a person who tends to be compliant like I am, believe it or not, if someone commands you to do something and you're one of those who are compliant, I want you to raise your hand right now. Am I the only one in this auditorium? My goodness. So maybe you're more like this. You're more like the person that when someone commands you to do something, you dig in your heels. If you're one of those, I want you to raise your hand right now. Now that shocks me. You know why? Because I just commanded you to raise your hand and you actually did it. Because I know my wife, when someone says something like that to her, raise your hand, she's going to say, only if I want to. But I think we would agree that our reaction to being commanded to do something has a whole lot to do with who it is doing the commanding, right? So I want you to join me today in Exodus chapter 20. And I want you to know this, that many skeptics believe that the Ten Commandments are actually just borrowed from some other old ancient law codes, and that Moses was simply a power freak who wanted to be able to wield control over the people that he was leading. In other words, they think God had really nothing to do with this. They fail to recognize, though, that the Ten Commandments are actually in the midst of covenant. They're made in the context of covenant. They're made in the context of mercy, of grace, of love. Yahweh, who is creator, who has been deliverer, knows what is best for us. You know why? Because he created us. And as creator, he knows what's best for us. And so he issues these commandments to bless our lives. That's how life works best. And so last week, I brought you to the marriage altar in Exodus chapter 19. The children of Israel are brought forward to the base of Mount Sinai. It's as if they have been walked down the aisle to meet their spouse, God. And they're getting ready to enter into a covenant relationship in which vows are shared. And we talked last week about ancient covenant forms and how they tend to follow a certain pattern. The first thing is that there's an introduction of the speaker, and that's followed by a historical review. And that's followed by stipulations and terms of the agreement, and that's followed by provisions for sealing the covenant. And that's what we see happen in Exodus chapters 20 to 24. It involves all of those things. It's the ancient suzerain vassal treaty form. But the Bible uses that, but then there's some obvious, some overt changes that are made in it. Now, the stipulations of the covenant are given in two forms in these chapters. The first is a short form. A short form where there are absolute principles given, and we call those the Ten Commandments. But then in the following chapters, there's almost like case law, where those 10 commandments are then put in the context of actual events, actual possible scenarios, so that it can be better understood how those laws are to be lived out. And so let's look at how it follows that form. The speaker's introduced to us in chapter 20 and verse 1, where it says, "And God spoke all these words." Listen, Moses did not speak these words. Yahweh spoke these words. And next comes the historical review, verse 2, where he says, "I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Now, as I mentioned last week, in these ancient treaties, this part of the treaty was a way of the king who is issuing this covenant to tell the people, to remind them, I conquered you. I was stepping on your neck. So if you don't enter a covenant with me, I will wipe you out. And this is where God's treaty with Israel takes a huge turn, because God says, I'm the one who delivered you. I'm the one who brought you out. I'm the one who rescued you from slavery. So that there's a whole different motive for entering into this covenant with God. It's not a covenant to be accepted on coercion. It's a covenant to be accepted out of gratitude for deliverance. And that idea is very important to us. The idea of obedience being an expression of gratitude, because that's vital to our Christian theology of salvation. You see, the law of Moses wasn't given so that the Jews could work to fulfill the law so that God would then save them. They were saved in Egypt before they ever had the law. God's already delivered them. And so now, what is the proper response to having experienced God's salvation? The proper response is to live in obedience to God. This idea that a person can be saved and then live in disobedience to God from a biblical perspective, that is unthinkable. And to live like that is to show such a great misunderstanding of what Jesus Christ has done for us. The one who, as Paul said in Colossians 1:13, has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. And our response to that is to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Now, there's many sincere Christians that think that a covenant with God is one-sided. That God, we come to him for salvation, we come to him for the forgiveness of sins, we come to him to be relieved of our guilt, and fail to realize that the other side of that covenant is the necessity of committing ourselves to him, of committing ourselves to belonging to him, so that he is without rival, so that he is without limit in our lives. And so now we come to the stipulations of the covenant. And this short form, as I said, is what we know as the Ten Commandments. And they are stated in absolutes. Because you see, in covenant with God, God is saying, this is the way it's going to be. You enter into covenant with me, that's a choice you're making, but this is the way it's going to be. There are some unchanging principles. There are some eternal principles of behavior that will govern our relationship with God. And as creator of the universe, Yahweh can define what those unchanging principles of behavior are going to be. Because again, He made us and He knows how we function best. And what are those unchangeable principles? Well, here they are, beginning in verse 3 of Exodus 20. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses His name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreign residents in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, but He rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. There's lots of parents right now with little kids saying, remember that one. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, the first four of these commandments have to do directly with our relationship with God, with His oneness, with His transcendence, with His holiness, and also with the sanctity of time. The last six speak to our relationship with other people. And at first glance, on the surface, that proportion might seem strange, because after all, this is a covenant God is inviting Israel to come into with Him. It's a covenant with God. You would think that there would be more stipulations about God than about how we treat each other. But it's intended to teach us, as I said last week, this is intended to teach us about the character of God. God values people. And if we are going to live in covenant with God, then we will take on the values that God has, and we too will value people. So the first commandment establishes this fact: there is only one God. And I want you to catch this. He doesn't offer some kind of a complex philosophical argument to convince these people to worship Him alone. All God says basically is, if you're going to be mine, then you can't recognize any other gods. There is no thing, there is no person, there is no idea, there is no concept, there is no dream, there is no power that can come before me. Nothing will be your God except for Yahweh. And if anything else is your God, then you don't belong to Yahweh. Second command is deceptively simple. Don't make any images of Yahweh. Now remember, these people are coming out of 400 years of living in Egyptian paganism, where they have seen God after God after God and images of those gods all around them, everywhere they go. And to attempt, though, to confine Yahweh to an image is actually to discount Him. It's to take Him less seriously. The third command often gets trivialized. Because for most people, what they hear in the third command is you can't curse, you can't swear using God's name. Now, I would admit that's involved in this command. But the meaning of this command goes way beyond that. The meaning of this command is really caught up in the idea of God's name. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Because in ancient times, name represented one's nature. Name represented one's character. And so if we take God's name in vain, which means if we empty His name, when we treat Him too casually, when we make Him appear less than I am, we have violated this covenant, this particular commandment. Can I tell you, brothers and sisters, calling God the man upstairs is really discounting Yahweh. Calling Him the big boss, those are the kinds of things that are violating this command. He's much more than that. He's not to be trivialized. And when we do that, we have emptied His nature. We have emptied Him of His character and its true meaning, and we have taken His name in vain. But let me tell you, it goes beyond that. When we grudgingly and boringly give Him an hour of our week and think that we have fulfilled His purposes for us, we have taken His name in vain. And when we behave as if He lives to serve us, as if He lives to accomplish what we want or what we desire, as if He lives to be our rabbit's foot to go to heaven, we have taken His name in vain. We're to make His name the most important thing about our lives. To demonstrate that there is none like Him. Now, in the fourth commandment, Yahweh tells us to keep the Sabbath, or tells Israel to keep the Sabbath. And I have to be careful on this one because we are too quick to write this one off, because after all, we are Christians and we meet on the first day of the week. First day of the week is Resurrection Day. It's the day to celebrate. You did know that, don't you? Okay, just making sure, because some of you, I'm not sure you're really feeling like celebrating today. And that's okay, we don't always feel that way. But it's a day to celebrate the empty tomb. It's Resurrection Day, and that's why we meet on Sundays. That's right. But I still think there's a principle here that because we're so quick to want to write off Sabbath that we totally miss. And I get more kickback from this probably than just about anything I ever talk about. You see, God, being God, the one who wired us and made us, knows that we need a time to just pull back and rest in Him. Now, whether that has to be Saturday or not, that's one thing. But every one of us needs a time where we pull away from all the distractions and pull away from all of the busyness, and we just rest in Him. Because I think the whole point of this commandment is God is saying, I am your provider. I will take care of you. In fact, listen to what He's saying in this ancient world. It goes totally against the grain and probably would do more so in America today. Because what He's saying is, Israel, you're going to be unlike any other nation. I want you to take one day of the week to do nothing but rest in me. And guess what? You're going to still have crops that rival your neighboring countries. You're still going to have an economy that's as strong as your neighboring countries. I want you to trust in me. We see what it's done for Chick-fil-A, right? Hadn't hurt them. Time is a gift from God, and we need to recognize that. Now, in the remainder of these commandments, God is saying that people who are in relationship with Him should treat other people in certain ways. And this is often where our commitment to Him is most tested. And so the first thing He says, number 5, is honor your father and mother. Now, there's an interesting thing when it comes to commandments. I hope you can follow my logic here. I realize that's a challenge sometimes. Commandments are easy to keep if you want to keep them. But if you don't want to keep them, there's a real tendency to want to reject them. Which I would suggest to you, when a commandment is given, if you don't want to keep it, that's the whole reason the commandment was given. Are you following me? It wouldn't need to be given if we automatically wanted to do it. Commandments are intended to change our behavior. And it's only then that we show our true trust and obedience when it's put to the test. And this commandment to honor your father and mother, here in this audience today, there are a number of people who have no problem with that commandment. Because you've been raised in a home where you were nurtured. You were raised in a home where you experienced blessing, where your parents loved you, where they encouraged you. This commandment's not hard. But I know that there are a number of people in this audience that this commandment makes you cringe. Because maybe you were abused, you mistreated, constantly put down, not encouraged. And that's where the challenge really comes, doesn't it? But that's the purpose of commandments, is to change our behaviors. Because if we choose to go through life blaming someone else for who we are and for what we have become, we will forever live in slavery. We will live in bondage. Sixth, he says, do not murder. The King James did a great disservice to us when it originally rendered that word, do not kill. It is clearly a Hebrew word that means murder. And there is a difference between killing and murdering. This commandment, I don't think, speaks directly to questions like capital punishment. It doesn't speak directly to this idea of justified war, which that's an oxymoron in itself sometimes, isn't it? The justified war. And Christians differ in their view of these things. I've often used Romans 13, for example, as an example or as a proof text for capital punishment being okay. And maybe that's where you are. It's where I used to be. I've changed my opinion of that, and I'm not going to argue with you biblically about it. You just be convicted in wherever you feel led by that. But I have chosen at this point in my life to read Scripture through a lens of grace and through a lens of mercy. And I know that God calls for me to be merciful or I will not receive mercy. So I just feel like on issues like this, I'm going to leave that one to God. I'm just going to leave it to God. But I hope that regardless of where we are on issues like that we can all agree that this commandment is calling us to value human life. Can you agree with me on that? We are to value human life. Every human life, from the womb to the tomb, is precious in God's sight. Every human life, from the womb to the tomb, is a gift from God. And it is not to be extinguished by human beings. Seventh, do not commit adultery. God has gifted human beings to enjoy their sexuality within the confines of a committed relationship. A relationship between a man and a woman within marriage covenant vows. And there is freedom that God gives within those boundaries. Outside of God's boundaries, this pure, beautiful sexual relationship becomes impure. And we've discussed, well, adultery means this, and fornication means this, and this, blah, 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 blah. And there's some truth to that, but can I tell you, the word adultery simply means to make something impure. And God says, do not commit adultery. Do not make what I have given you as pure, do not make it impure. How do you make it impure? By using it outside of the boundaries with which God has given that beautiful blessing. And so God doesn't have to say also here and make 15 or 20 commandments. He doesn't say, you shall not commit homosexuality. He doesn't have to say, you shall not live with each other outside of marriage. He doesn't have to say, you should not commit bestiality or pedophilia or premarital sex. He doesn't need to say that, because all of those make this gift that is pure impure. For those who would argue that they have a right to fulfill their sexual needs in whatever way they choose to do, let me just say this. God is your creator, and He knows how you can best enjoy what He has given. And He wants to be the ultimate supplier of all of your needs. And so you need to live your life committed to Him and His purposes in all purity. And it's really as simple as that. Eighth, he says, do not steal. Now, our culture has nurtured this idea that we are entitled. And so if you have more than I do, then I have a right to take something that you have. And obviously that's wrong. That's stealing. But you know, stealing can also be when those who have oppose those who don't have. And our God is a God of justice. And someday He's going to justify everything. He's going to make everything perfect. He's going to make everything right. He's going to make everything fair and just. But until then, we need to allow God, we need to trust God to be the supplier of our needs. Ninth, do not bear false witness. We usually summarize this one by saying you shouldn't lie. And that's certainly part of this commandment. But I want you to read again. I want you to at least hear again what He says. Verse 16, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. The focus of that commandment is not so much my integrity as much as the way that I handle my neighbor's integrity. Do you see that? Because I can tell the truth about you, but I can tell the truth about you in such a way through the tone of my voice or through my body language that I can actually communicate something about you that would not be very good about you. You understand what I'm saying? I could give a false witness about you. And I believe what God is saying here is what is important is the effect that your words have on your neighbor's reputation. And 10th, he says, don't covet. Now, it's as if the 10 Commandments are bookended nearly. Because twice in the New Testament, Paul connects covetousness with idolatry. Ephesians 5:5 and Colossians 3:5. Now, on the surface, that might not seem obvious. How can covetousness be idolatry? But Paul says that our desires for something that belongs to somebody else actually drives idol worship. Which brings us back to the first commandments about how we are to view God. And my needs and my desires and my rights can often become my gods. But in America, covetousness has become a virtue. We thrive on covetousness. It drives our economy. Every ad on TV or magazine wants to convince you that you're poor because you don't have something. And it's amazing how I can be totally satisfied with where I am and what I have until you get something that I become attracted to. And then I really want it. And my want drives me to then feel my entitlement syndrome kick in. And so I'll go into debt to have whatever it is you have in order to surpass or at least get level with where you are. And millions of Americans today live in bondage to debt. Oftentimes, I'm not always saying, but oftentimes it's because they are driven by covetousness. And so all these commands are saying one thing. They're saying, let the sovereign, holy God have his rightful place in your life. Surrender your false trust in yourself and trust in him. Tim Hansel, a number of years ago, wrote a book entitled Holy Sweat. And he tells this story. He says one day he and his son Zach were out in the country and they were climbing around on some cliffs. And he said, all of a sudden I heard a voice yell out to me, "Hey Dad, catch me." And he said, I turned to look in time to realize that he had jumped before he said, "Hey Dad, catch me." And so he said, I went into a circus performance as I turned and tried to catch him midair, and we fell backwards. And he said, for a moment I could hardly even speak. He said, when I found my voice, I gasped in exasperation, "Zach, can you give me one good reason for what you just did?" And he said, Zach responded with remarkable calmness and said, "Sure, because you're my dad." His whole assurance was based on the fact that his dad was trustworthy. And he could live life to the hilt because his dad could be trusted. And oh, I wish we could see that when it comes to the Ten Commandments. This is God's will. This is God's desire for us. And it's not his will and desire for us because he wants to punish us. And the Ten Commandments weren't given to us to try to limit us or to rob us of joy. The Ten Commandments weren't given to us to simply show arbitrarily to us that God is boss and he can say what he wants. God gives us these commands because God made us and God loves us and God wants us to live healthy, happy lives. He wants us to live the best life. He wants us to live his life. And so we call you to that today. If you're not following in the footsteps of Jesus, we encourage you to come and live the abundant life with him. Put him on in baptism. Begin your walk with him this day. We have opportunity if you need prayers over any particular aspect of your life. If you want to pray in private with an elder and his wife, make your way to room 102. But we encourage you as we stand now together and we sing this invitation song.